Well, today I have a very pleasant job of introducing a dear friend of some 30 years, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So Shashi, how old were you when I first met you? 10 years old? Well, simply put, Shashi is among the most distinguished and talented people of his generation. Legislator, author, diplomat, speaker. You may have seen him on the Colbert Show, I think at least a couple of times, or recently on an Oxford Union debate intervention that went viral with over 3 million views. He has been twice elected to the Indian Parliament from the city of Trivandrum in southern India, once with a margin of over 100,000 votes. Now, Trivandrum is a city where I obtained my undergraduate degree. So both Shashi and I want to be sure that Trivandrum will be known for the high caliber of public servants it is associated with, whether it's in Delhi or in DC. Dr. Tharoor has been twice a minister in India's Council of Ministers, first for External Affairs and then for Education. Today, he serves as the chair of the Parliament's Standing Committee on External Affairs. Think of that as a combination of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Before his foray into politics, Shashi was Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and its prominent public face. At the UN, over a period of 28 years, he held a series of important UN responsibilities, including peacekeeping operations and the care of refugees. Shashi is the quintessential global citizen, born in London, brought up in India, higher studies in the United States, where he received his PhD from Tufts at the age of 21, served in Geneva, Singapore, and New York with the United Nations, books translated into a number of languages, his columns carried in newspapers around the world. I'd say few are more global in existence than him. It used to be said of Senator Daniel Moynihan that he had written more books than many of his colleagues had read. One might well say the same about Shashi, who's authored over a dozen books, covering a wide range: policy, history, current affairs, and fiction. Two books that I would especially recommend are The Great Indian Novel, a fictional depiction, very tongue-in-cheek, of 20th century Indian history, and Pax Indica, a magisterial assessment of India's foreign policy. Today we will hear Shashi speak first, and then we will have time for Q&A. So without further ado, may I present to you the Honourable Member of the Indian Parliament, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Welcome.
How long do you have? Thank you, Arun, for that very, very generous introduction. It's the kind of introduction, as Lyndon Johnson used to like to say, that my late father would have been proud of, but only my mother would have believed. I'll update him on some of the facts separately when we're together. But great to see you all. Apologies for being late. And it really did take much longer than we had anticipated. But I'm glad to be with you, and I'll try to summarize the theme that Arun and I had discussed I would address you on today, the networked world, in a series of quick points so that we could then perhaps have an exchange, including on what I might not have said that you would have perhaps felt was necessary. And I want to stress that despite having been a UN official and having worked around the world, I now see the world very much from the perspective of a member of parliament in a democracy. And every member of parliament elected in India represents a constituency where there's a majority of people who live on less than $2 a day. So the world looks very different from their perspective than perhaps sitting here, even in the Commerce Department. But some of the things, nonetheless, are verities that apply to all. And I thought I'd sort of inflict 9 quick points on you. I could have gone on beyond that, but I remember Woodrow Wilson came up with the 14 points to end the First World War. The then French President Clemenceau said 14 points, even the good Lord only had 10. So I thought we might just keep it below 10, so I'll stop at 9, but here goes. The first point that I'd like to stress is, of course, that there's no escaping globalization, which seems such a banal thing to say. But it really is startling the extent to which everything in our world seems to reflect the degree of globalization that has occurred in the last couple of decades. I was commenting the other day on the headlines a few years ago about the tragic death of Princess Diana. And you might well ask, what's that got to do with globalization? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani, is driven in a German car with a Dutch engine by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish liquid. They're chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese scooters into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the entire story is being told to you in Washington by an Indian member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram. Now, there's globalization. So, but jokes apart, obviously this is something that's true. My own country had gone really the other way for many, many decades immediately after independence. I mean, here in America, you all axiomatically assume capitalism, associate capitalism with freedom. But in India, the leaders associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so the entire logic of the nationalist leaders was, if you want to preserve the political independence you fought so long and hard for, you need to ensure your economic independence. So they were suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, seeing in him the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge, that somebody may come in saying they want to trade, they want to invest, what they really want to do is rule you. Which demonstrates that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. But the result of that is that the protectionist barriers went up. We put bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of our economy. And we spent the first 4.5 decades after independence in 1947 really subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty. So it's important to understand that that's the background from which we entered into the globalization business. The dramatic shift in 1991, when India faced such a financial crisis of world-class proportions that we had to ship our physical stocks of gold to London to stand collateral for an IMF loan. And at that point, the entire political establishment realized they couldn't continue like this, and the liberalization of the Indian economy then happened. And it's been followed with an integration into the globalized system with few parallels. I would say that India has become a very globalized economy in ways that people like Arun and me, when we were growing up, we could not have assumed. So today, a young person will wake up in India now to an alarm clock made in China, down a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, don jeans originally designed in America, take a Japanese scooter or a Korean car if they're lucky to get to an Indian college, where their textbooks, of course, will be printed in German-invented technology on paper pulped in Sweden. They'll call their friends on a Finnish phone if they still have a Nokia, or a Taiwanese or Chinese one today, to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what they might think of as an Indian meal, except that it'll feature naan that came to India from Persia, or tandoori chicken that was taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, the Mughals, that's where they came from. And the two most popular vegetables of the common man in India are potatoes and green chilies, which were unknown in the subcontinent till 400 years ago when they came to us after the discovery of Latin America. And of course, the most authentically nativist thing is suspicion of anything foreign. Now, this is the world in which we're all living, and Indians, I think, now realize very clearly that the kinds of assumptions that the first decades after independence had featured are simply no longer possible, that what the world is in fact, there's a wonderful old line about water pollution, that we all live downstream. And I'd say that applies to everything, economic activities, your security, doesn't just depend on local, on warding off local threats, but there are threats that can come to you from abroad. In our case, quite literally, we've experienced that from across the waters. But the entire realization that what happens in North America or Southern Africa can affect us in northern or southern India that is now, I think, pretty much sunk in. Second point is that there is a paradox at the heart of this globalized world I've been describing to you, because we think of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, the information technology revolution that has brought to breakfast tables, to our living rooms, to our mobile phones, snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are what one might call the forces of convergence, forces that have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But they're also the opposite, coexisting in equal salience. When you think about the challenges facing this world of convergence, you find the forces of disruption. Terrorism, which America woke up to most starkly on 9/11. India's had many, many other encounters with it. The rise in violent manifestations of intolerance in so many parts of the world. The wars in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. And these have now got to a point where they threaten not only the people directly affected there, but they threaten to create new divisions between North and South, between people of one particular faith and those who don't share that faith, between haves and have-nots. And these divisions, in a sense, remind us of Huntington's thesis just a couple of decades ago of a clash of civilizations. I don't happen to agree with that, but the very notion has entered our discourse because the very forces that through globalization seem to be pushing us together are also through this disruption pulling us apart. And it seems to me that, that this paradox is part of the sort of edginess of the world, the networked world we're living in today. But before I get to explaining the networking, let me get to my third point, which is this globalization doesn't only flow in one direction anymore. It did to begin with, and it flowed from here, no longer true. In fact, if you take the broader historical perspective, when the Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay at the peak of the British Empire because he was an Indian and Indians weren't admitted, he decided to build a grander, more opulent hotel that would be open to Indians, and that was the Taj Mahal Hotel. Now, Pike's, of course, is long since closed, whereas the Taj flourishes as one of the greatest hotels in the world. When the same Mr. Tata set up India's first steel mill in 1905, in the teeth of implacable British hostility, one of the British colonial officials of the day sneeringly said that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. I rather regret, I just wish he had lived long enough to see the day when the descendants of the same Mr. Tata bought up the remnants of British steel through their acquisition of Corus a few years ago. It might have given him a bad case of indigestion. Or just a couple of months ago, when this internet message went around, perhaps we Indians saw it more often than the rest of you do, of British Prime Minister David Cameron setting off in a Jaguar escorted by a Land Rover to meet the Queen in Buckingham Palace. And the message going around is the British Prime Minister drives an Indian car because the Tatas own Jaguar and Land Rover as well. This is, I think, a reminder that it's necessary to set aside the old stereotypes of who can and cannot excel at what in our globalizing world. Take a number of things where the US used to be on top of the heap for decades. Right now, the smartest executive jets are made by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which overtook the previous tallest building in Taipei, which in turn supplanted one in Malaysia. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The Challenger to the Panama Canal, cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by China. The biggest shopping mall is in Beijing. And the country with the highest per capita income in the world is not the US, but Singapore. 30 years ago, every one of these categories would have been headed by the US. Of course, the US remains the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up in areas where the US was totally dominant. And I agree, I think it was Fareed Zakaria who said first, that it's not the decline of the West so much as the rise of the rest. But that is definitely a phenomenon that we have to bear in mind today. And if you look at the BRICS countries, for example, all estimates, Goldman Sachs, I think, was the most recent, project that by 2040, the economies of the BRICS countries will collectively overtake those of the original G7, collectively. Now, we in India have seen this reversal all the more dramatically, and not just in the Jaguar Land Rover story. When I came to graduate school in the US in 1975, believe me, no one would have mentioned India and technology in the same breath. Today, we're seeing a very different phenomenon, the migration of people like Arun and a number of other bright Indian graduates of our elite engineering institutions to places like Silicon Valley have helped create a totally different perception of what India is all about here in the US. And of course, the engineers excelled in the freedoms afforded to them in the US to create. And now we have what? An Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian created Hotmail, a third helped start Sun Microsystems, one of the co-founders. Indians have been involved in some of the 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley. And now the Indianness of engineers and software developers has begun to be taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. In fact, I was struck by how Americans in certain circles speak of the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, in much the same way that once they would only have spoken of MIT or Caltech. Mind you, some of this means a welcome reversal of cliche, because there was a time when most people saw India as, naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, or fellows doing the Indian rope trick, snake charmers and the Indian rope trick, all of that. Today, it's a very different set of images, and it can sometimes have unintended consequences. A friend of mine was accosted at Schiphol Airport not long ago by an anxiously perspiring European saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? The stereotypes are changing, and it's important to realize how much. I'm going to have to abbreviate the remaining points so we have more time for discussion. Fourth, the new millennium is a time for diversity. As I said, I disagree with Huntington because I believe that every one of the civilizations he's identified has tremendous diversity within it. Not one of them is a monolith. Religion and culture merely amongst the many variables that govern the actions of states and governments. And just having a religion in common doesn't guarantee a particular point of view. Look at the way in which Islamic states differ over ISIS or over the Taliban, for example, amongst themselves. But coming from India, where I'm particularly conscious of the diversities that I'm alluding to on the global scale, particularly because in my country, we're living with paradoxes all the time. I make a lot of public speeches about India, and I like to say very often that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And it almost invariably is. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. We think of ourselves as an IT powerhouse striding into the 21st century, but a majority of our population still lives in each of the other 20 centuries. I can give example after example, but in the interest of time, I won't. But quite often, the opposites coexist quite cheerfully. We have this big Hindu religious festival called the Kumbh Mela, and there was a picture that went around the internet from the last Kumbh Mela of a naked sadhu right out of Hollywood central casting, right? This is a fellow sort of Hindu sage, sort of type 1.0, if you like, matted hair, scraggly beard, a necklace of beads around his neck, naked torso, staring away into the distance, for all the world, a picture of timeless otherworldliness. Except that in this photo that went around the internet, this naked holy man was chatting away into a mobile phone. Now that is, in some ways, a perfect image of what India is all about. The paradox of a country in which that naked holy man can talk into a mobile phone is what our diversity is all about. In this country, Benjamin Barber wrote some years ago of the big challenges facing humanity as being the clash between jihad and McWorld, which he defined in terms of Jihad in the name of 100, and quoting from him here, the name of 100 narrowly conceived fates against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, versus a Mac world of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers, and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park. That's Barber, quote unquote. But of course, the interesting thing is the world is even more complicated than that. Those are stark opposites, but both tend to appeal to extreme versions of people's beliefs, and they do so by obliterating the complexities of their identities beneath. And I think very clearly, if, as they said during the First World War, the 20th century was about making the world safe for democracy, the 21st century in many ways is going to have to be about making the world safe for diversity. And I think that we will find that the idea that is prevalent in America and indeed in India, and familiar to multi-ethnic democracies, that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of sounds you make when you speak, the kind of food you eat, the kind of God you choose to worship or not, so long as you want to play by the same rules and dream the same dreams. It's not essential in a democratic world to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. And that's been the secret of the success of your democracy, and that's what's kept ours ticking for over 7 decades in India. Fifth, the new world is still seeing the rise of old problems, and religion is the most obvious one. Many of us would like to think that that religion is a part of our identity, but not necessarily the most fundamental one, that it's something that manifests itself on a Sunday morning when you go to church, or a Friday afternoon when you go to the mosque or whatever, but that it's one aspect of our diversity, that each of us has a number of other identities at the same time, Commerce Department official, Washington Redskins fan, whatever. I mean, there are different things that seem to matter more to us at a particular time than our religion. And yet we have to ask, how is it that, that for so many, the clarion call of religion seems to triumph over other appeals? I just read in the paper coming over today of a Jordanian member of parliament whose son, who had been brought up with all the comforts of an affluent elite life in Jordan and was studying medicine, went off not just to join ISIS, but then to become a suicide bomber and blow himself up at a military base and killing a number of people. And it's difficult really to understand the power of that appeal, but that it exists is undeniable. And I think for us, part of the challenge now is to cope with this through perhaps encouraging the acceptance of different identities, rejecting pressure to conform, but at the same time resisting the reduction of people to that kind of extreme commitment to a particular point of view that then leads into a particular cause. Now I come to the idea of the networked world, which is that flowing from all these 5 points is my sixth one, that the old binary world of the Cold War is well and truly over, and we're living in a different era. To me, the real metaphor for understanding globalization today is the World Wide Web. It's a world in which we are all connected in multiple ways. And governments, too, now are networked. And they're networked through connections which in some cases overlap, in some cases don't. And some have common membership, some don't. But it connects all of us around the world in this extraordinarily complex and yet very simple way. I mean, let me give you an Indian example. Our foreign minister meets every year with her counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and she meets every year something called BRICS. Then she takes out the Russians, but keeps the Chinese, and the same countries meet in a forum called BASIC for environmental negotiations. But then she leaves out both the Chinese and the Russians and meets with Brazil and South Africa in something called IBSA for South-South cooperation. And India is the only country that's a member of all of these groupings, not merely because its name begins with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, but also because it has a contribution to make in each of these forums and gains from the existence of each of these forums. And this kind of World Wide Web style networking is prevalent for, I'm sure, every other country. One can find comparable examples. But if you look at the way in which the networks work globally, again, if I can be excused for taking an Indian example, India can be and is simultaneously a leading member of the United Nations, advocating passionately for a permanent seat in the Security Council, and can also be focused extraordinarily on its own neighborhood, the 7-country grouping known as the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. It can continue to be a member of the non-aligned movement, reflecting its old anti-colonial heritage, its anti-imperial legacy. And it can be a member, and it is an active member of the community of democracies alongside the very Western powers which it has railed against or attacked in the non-aligned movement. It can be a member of the sort of global trade union of developing countries, the G77 at the UN, while also being a member of the global management of the world's macroeconomy, by being a prominent member of the G20. So all of these paradoxes suggest to me, when I was minister in the previous government, I suggested that we should think beyond non-alignment to multi-alignment. The phrase never quite caught on, but that's really what's happening. We are getting more and more multi-aligned, and so I believe are most of the countries in this world. And of course, all of us in every country are exposed to both the opportunities that such a network world provides and the vulnerabilities it brings in. For every one of you in this room, of course, we have to think about issues like terrorism, but beyond that, transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, even imported illnesses like swine flu or bird flu. All of these have come into our lives and our headlines in the course of the last couple of decades as part of the network world. And I think in many ways, even talking about foreign policy seems to me to be slightly pointless, because clearly the world is now so interdependent that the distinction between any meaningful domestic policy to deal with these phenomena and external policies become meaningless, because the problems originate and spread globally all the time. And we see this, of course, with opportunities as well. The climate change negotiations coming up, the Sustainable Development Goals just adopted at the UN. So there are both the pluses and the minuses. The effect of the China market distortions on all our economies demonstrates this again. Seventh, this involves obviously accepting this process and working for change. Very briefly, I've been increasingly concerned that the statesmanship shown by the leaders of the world in 1945, when they set up the international institutions that make all of our lives possible, your careers in international trade and commerce, are the result of accepting that we want a world different from the first half of the 20th century. We wanted a world where people could look on each other not as objects of suspicion, but as partners who were able to exchange goods, ideas, people for mutual benefit. And that idea, enshrined in the United Nations politically, in the Bretton Woods institutions when it comes to finance, is beginning to fray at the edges only because 70 years have gone by and the rules written then are now being applied in a very different world. At the UN, you're seeing now the countries that were left out of the high table back in 45 saying, hey, we need a place too, because Japan and Germany are the second and third largest donors to the UN, but the UN Charter still calls them enemy states. India is one of the most important peacekeeping contributors to the UN, and the world's largest democracy, and a major contributor to the UN's Democracy Fund, at the very top of the pile. But it doesn't find that recognized at the high table. And so these countries say, let's reform the Security Council in order to, again, incorporate in it the countries that are making a contribution to international cooperation today as the original countries around the table in 1945 did. And there, I mean, it's a very simple rule in world affairs. You're either at the table or on the menu. And a lot of countries now are no longer prepared to remain on the menu when they feel they've earned the right to be at the table. And I look at the Bretton Woods institutions. You know, everyone accepted at the Pittsburgh G20 summit in 2008 that it was absurd that China had the same weighted vote as Belgium. That it was absurd that in the kind of global system today, that you saw international economics as, you know, a handful of rich countries sort of monitoring the economic delinquency of the poor. The world has moved on, the world has changed, and there was an agreement reached to shift some of the voting power in the Bretton Woods institutions. So there'd be parity between the original developed countries, the original rich countries, and the newly emerged or emerging and transition economies. But what happened? Never got implemented because, of course, it didn't get ratified in Washington. And the result now is very simple. The Chinese have gone and set up rival institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the new development bank that BRICS has set up with an Indian private banker as its president. What are they implicitly saying? Give us a level playing field on the world stage, but if you don't, we will go and construct our own playing field. Now, the world can't afford that. We must show today the kind of statesmanship that would actually manage to keep us all on that same playing field together, as the far-sighted men and women of 1945 were able to accomplish. I really have taken longer than I intended to, so I'll quickly summarize. Eighth point would have been, but I won't go into it now, the role of in the information society, the internet era, whether that can be a democratizing tool, that can bring us all together. But as you can imagine, it brings its own challenges as well. If you're interested, we'll discuss that during the Q&A. I think that in some ways, the internet has been a democratizing tool. In other ways, it has widened certain gaps and certain divisions as well. I certainly believe that it's not enough to think just about the poverty line. We have to think about the fiber optic line and the high-speed digital line and all of those lines as well, because the key, in many ways, to our futures in this century is the keyboard, and those who don't have one are literally not connected to the networked world I was talking about. And ninth and finally, each of you obviously has a very key role to play in making this networked world work, but seeing how it can be made to work in the interests of all. I'm very conscious that we're like Egyptian mummies, you know, strapped for time. So let me pull my threads together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond world domination by any one country anymore to cooperative relationships in a networked world. Sovereign nation states will continue to proudly guard their sovereignties, but the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transform the very definition of the word and dilutes its old meanings of sovereignty. Many of us, I think, will acknowledge that though we all belong, Americans and Indians, belong to countries that proudly celebrate their Independence Day, the time has probably come for us to realize that every other day on the calendar is really an interdependence day. Let me stop there and hope that you will continue to constructively contribute to the progress of this networked world. I'm happy to take your questions and comments.
Yes.
So the phrase that struck me was safeguarding diversity. The phrase that you used that really struck me today was safeguarding diversity. That is going to be our goal. Can you hear me? I didn't catch that. Safeguarding diversity. Yes. Okay. Okay, so... can you speak into that? Okay. There are counter theories on, on enlarging the interdependence. You were talking about Swiss tunnels and Scotch liquid. Do you want more of that so we're at a kind of a detente where, mutual destruction is assured if we go out of line? Or do you think the future would be more, like you said, several playing fields, all operating, but at different parallels, so that you do preserve diversity, but you don't have this global circus? And number two, well, no.
Thanks. Yeah, I get it. I think the answer would depend very much on the issues. If you're looking at a global financial architecture, if you're looking at international law and international organizations, you definitely want one global playing field that everyone feels they have equal stake in. That's the one thing that can prevent conflict, misunderstanding. In fact, the danger, for example, of two playing fields when it comes to something like the international financial institutions is that the role that has so usefully been played by the Bretton Woods institutions for 6 decades at least, if not 7, will not be filled by any one alternative, because now there'll be different alternatives and people will go forum shopping in ways that undermine the principles that either side might want to actually advance. So in some areas, it seems to me you need a universal practice. In others, yes, you can have different playing fields that enshrine and promote diversity. I've often, for example, contrasted the American attitude to domestic diversity and the Indian. I mean, you really do create a melting pot here, that people come from different parts of the world. And from the point of view of us foreigners, within a generation, you all sound alike, dress alike, eat alike. I mean, it's quite startling the extent to which people become assimilated into a certain American model of living, of thinking, of speaking, and so on. Whereas you come to a country like India, and the differences are starkly apparent. Differences which, I mean, people living within their own religious identities, their own caste patterns, their own linguistic groups, their own styles of dressing. But the reason it works as well as yours does in this very different context is because everyone accepts everyone else's right to be what they are. In other words, that you can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, a good Indian all at once, because each of these other identities is secure within the carapace of the larger Indian identity. So these are different ways of doing it. The French, their notion of laïcité obliges them now to not allow any child to come to school with any religious symbol. A Christian can't wear a cross around her neck. A Sikh can't wear a turban. In fact, Sikhs have been expelled from every government school in France because the Sikh religion obliges them to wear a turban. A Muslim girl can't cover her head, etc., etc. Now, in India, it's exactly the opposite. We go to school with people wearing all of these, and it teaches us in many ways to respect their individual distinctiveness in the way they dress, the faith they practice, the foods they eat, and so on. It seems to me that both models have their own specific value, and that's why they should both and all of them be allowed to exist and continue. That's an example where the world can do with many playing fields and not just one.
I was going to say that I think that the concept of globalization, the notion of globalization, is a very westernized, perhaps Eurocentric concept. And so I was wondering, as we assess the development of nations today that are emerging, is it necessarily a good criteria to use to assess how well they're doing, especially for perhaps lower performing countries on the lower side of the commodity chain who perhaps are still agrarian? Is it appropriate to say that they're not as developed because they aren't conforming to these more westernized views of what development actually is?
Right. I'm not sure I fully got the thrust of the question. The propositions in your question are all entirely valid and acceptable. That globalization can't mean the same thing to every country. Each country has its own ability to exploit the opportunities globalization provides. A poor agrarian African country that survives on sending its commodities, let's say, to Europe, has huge challenges benefiting from globalization when it's competing with European agricultural subsidies, for example. The European subsidies are so high right now, they can pay for every cow in Europe to fly business class around the world. Now, that's the kind of challenges that some will face. But at the same time, it's an inescapable reality. I mean, more and more one finds that what globalization has provided, even for those who would otherwise be poor and disadvantaged and marginalized, is the possibility of a global market. I can give you one example from a part of India which has suffered a lot because of terrorist violence and militancy and conflict, and that's Kashmir. A lot of Kashmiris traditionally used to make their living from handicrafts, so artisans. They do beautiful wood carvings, Kashmiri carpets, brass objects, so a number of things that were for centuries part of the economic sort of strength of Kashmir. But when you have all this stuff going on, it's difficult for tourists to come and buy your goods. It's difficult for you to get your goods to market. It's difficult for you to make the kind of income you were making earlier. So enter a young Kashmiri entrepreneur in his 20s who sets up KashmiriBazaar.com. And he goes to these artisans, picks up their products, photographs them attractively, puts them on the web, and has found a global market for people who would otherwise were losing even their national markets before. Now they're more prosperous than they'd ever been. So this kind of example of how both the existence of information technology, websites, etc., and the existence of a global market has made this transformation possible to people who otherwise would have perhaps slipped back into poverty because of a lack of access to customers.
Thank you. Excellent speech today. I know I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to have two. You talked about independence, interdependence, diversity, technology, innovation, connecting the line, if you will. Now, if you look at independence from a technology point of view, typically we are expecting that it is going to bring in more interdependence. But if you really look at people walking on the streets with smartphone, it's almost like losers, loners. You don't know where they're going. You know, the concept of interdependence as individuals is kind of going down. People are trying to live with the smartphones and themselves. So I'm not sure if it's really the technology is helping from that perspective. The second is, if the technology and all that we are trying to do at a global market level is to bring people, but if you really look at all the wars and all kinds of atrocities, terrorism going around the world, I think the number of killings and people losing life is more than, on an annual basis, maybe more than what happened during World War I or World War II. So that seems to be a paradox. So technology should be bringing in more happiness and wealth, but it seems to be potentially doing the opposite. Are the human beings going the right track? Are we developing a global army to fight against somebody maybe potentially in Mars? Or we are trying to kill ourselves? Where are we going, and is there a solution to this?
I wouldn't pretend to have an answer to the second question. Not sure any of us does. I mean, clearly, technology has done well for us, and at the same time is going to drive more and more of us out of jobs. It's striking. I mean, recently, for example, all these controversies and I think ongoing court cases about Uber drivers and so on. We have them in India. There's this notorious case of an Uber driver who raped a passenger. There's issues of tax, the issues of whether an Uber driver is an employee or an independent contract, all of this stuff going on. This entire debate will look academic if the world is full of driverless cars, which is where Google and Tesla and so on are going to be taking us. So yeah, technology could transform many of our assumptions about life, and in the end, those of us who are not inventing technology, what are we going to be doing to keep ourselves economically productive? I don't know. It's a good question. But on your first one about interdependence, I just genuinely think it is inescapable. I mean, today, everyone's jobs now no longer depend on just the local economy. The local economy itself is connected to other parts of the world. Faraway markets for their purchasing what you make here, for the goods they produce and sell to you here, for access to other parts of the world in order to have a viable system. The products that you're dealing with being assembled often in 6 or 7 different parts I mean, bits of 6 or 7 different parts being made in 6 or 7 different countries and assembled in one place. That's become so typical now as people look for advantages in every particular economy. So it seems to me that it's extremely difficult to argue against the existence of interdependence at every stage of our lives, in the jobs we do, and obviously things we travel. Here in America, you go to a doctor in many, many places, and after you've left at the end of the day, the doctor dictates his notes into a dictaphone, and then he goes to sleep, and while he's asleep, there's somebody in India transcribing them who's medically qualified to understand the terms he's using. So when he gets your case notes back in the morning, he's got them from someone in India. Or you know, MRIs being read more and more in other countries, or airline reservations being made in other countries, and so on. I think there's too many examples for us to really argue against the realistic notion that we cannot get away from interdependence anymore. Autarkic institutions are no longer possible.
You describe globalization and growing independence, and my impression is that it seems to be seemingly inexorable, and just ever greater quantities of this, a degree of this, at least for the foreseeable future, and also in India, India proper, that you see a similar trend. I wonder if you could share your views about South Asia. Now, South Asia seems to be an outlier in this. It is the least economically integrated region in the world, so far as I know.
That's right.
The intra-regional trade is low, and furthermore, the trend is discouraging, and it's not going anywhere. It seems to be time has almost stood still in South Asia. You go to Wagah, and you could do a 1947 Raj movie without modifying anything at all in the set. But what are your thoughts about how is globalization going to affect South Asia, if it ever will? I'd be interested in your views on that.
Well, it's a good question, and it's an absolute reflection of the extent to which politics and prejudice can trump the rational arguments for allowing globalization to prevail. And let's not mince words about what this is all about. This is about the fact that Pakistan has simply found it unable to have a normal trade relationship with India, as long as its grievances, real or imagined, with India aren't resolved to its satisfaction. So you're saying it's as if time has stood still. In many ways, it's gone back, because what used to be Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India were far more economically integrated before 1947 than they are now. So the time has gone. Time has moved in a negative direction. We now have absurdities like Indian goods being shipped to Dubai at great expense, where they're repackaged with made in UAE in order to be sold to Pakistan for Pakistani consumers to pay 3 times what they would need to pay if they simply shipped them across from India. This kind of nonsense is going on all the time, and it's a reflection of precisely the syndrome that you were driving at. Increasingly, however, the other countries seem to be willing to look beyond these things. Bangladesh was imprisoned by much the same sort of nationalist rhetoric when it came to trade with India, but those inhibitions seem to be slowly melting away. There's increasing talk of sub-regional integration, even if the whole region can't be, so that, for example, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and India could together cooperate on harnessing the river waters that flow amongst them in order to do everything from generating electricity to irrigating the soil. And this could become also a lifeline for commerce in those areas. If you think in terms of the potential, it's immense amongst all the countries of South Asia. And if you'll extend further, the northeast of India, we've had plans on the drawing board for quite some time to enhance connectivity with Myanmar by road, river, and rail, which would do two things simultaneously. It would actually enable goods and people from the northeast of India to go that much more easily to the eastern coast of India, rather than having to go around Bangladesh. They would simply go down directly to the port of Sitwe, or Lakyab, and they'd be right next to eastern India. Or the second thing it would do would be to completely open up access to Southeast Asia, again, for goods and people from the northeast. It's taken not much time to think this through, but it's taken an inordinate amount of time to bring it to fruition. And that's where both administrative sloth, inefficiency in implementation, some vested interests, some bureaucratic resistance, and so on, have all begun to play their part. But I'm convinced it's changing. It may not be changing fast enough for the tastes of most of us, but it is changing.
Holly, you get the last question.
Oh, thank you so much for being with us today. I really
Thank you.
appreciated your comment about how India is moving from a non-alignment to multi-alignment in its approaches in foreign policy. How do you think, given the unique roles that you've played, how can the U.S. and India work more effectively together on the global stage so that we bring out the best in each other?
Well, it's happening already to some degree, but more could be done. In fact, the bilateral relationship is in very good shape. And I think on bilateral issues, the two countries talk a lot. There's innumerable subgroups working together, including, I believe, one from your department here. But at the international organizations, the two still don't collaborate enough or see things the same way enough. Partly it's a legacy of old habits and practices. Partly I think it's genuinely a lack of effort in seeing this as an important stage. I'm not sure the US has yet fully bought in to the idea that India could be an extremely useful ally in everything from outer space to cyberspace, because these are all areas where India actually has something to contribute in terms of technological expertise, human resources, and where necessary, finance, while at the same time coming from a totally different part of the world, a developing country, a country of the global south, which the US should not, it seems to me, relegate always to an adversarial position or a position on the other side of the table. They could make common cause. For example, one obvious area in on cyberspace management is India being a democracy has far more in common with those in America who see the merits of multi-stakeholderism than with many of the other countries with which it might have made common cause 20 years ago in the UN on issues of this nature, because those countries are going to go much more in the direction of trying to promote government control and so on, which obviously both the US and India would want to resist. Now, here are areas where there could be much more dialogue and cooperation than I see happening. But I believe that there's an awful lot the two countries can do together. India, for its own part, has frankly been a rule taker for a long time from the rest of the international system, and feels readier than ever before to participate in the process of being one of the rule makers. But that can only happen if a country like the US makes room at the high table for it. As I mentioned, that hasn't always been forthcoming from the US. We've seen it with regard not just to India, but also to China at the Bretton Woods institutions. And if that kind of mentality persists, then a great opportunity would have been missed to coordinate and encourage cooperation between these two countries on the global scene, the multilateral scene as well. As I said, bilaterally things are going well, but this is an excellent complement that the two countries could move towards, but it'll need a little more of a broader vision, it seems to me, from decision makers in Washington than perhaps we've seen so far.
Maybe I can conclude with a comment on the bilateral relationship. Exactly 2 weeks ago, we held the first US-India strategic and commercial dialogue. The first time that this elevated dialogue was held. This was conceived when the president met with the prime minister back in January. And we at Commerce have been very proud of being part of this first dialogue. In fact, I was thinking to myself that if trade talks is a noun, it's what you just did. But when trade talks is a verb, that's a strategic and commercial dialogue where you're actually having commerce and business and economics at the center of the talks between two countries. So we are excited about that. We really believe that there's a lot of potential in that partnership. So Shashi, thank you for being here. And coming off a 20-hour flight, you were lucid as ever. So thank you. And I want to thank everybody here for joining us. A few quick thanks. Tu Trang, where's Tu Trang? There she is. Thank you for putting all this together. Rick Fisher for photography, and Marcus Johnson, Marcus here, and Rick, the back there, Rick Fisher for the videotaping, and then Laura Swift and Karen Krugman for hosting us in this beautiful library. So Shashi, thank you once again. Really appreciate it.